Okay, today's video we're going to talk about Bing advertising. Basically, what is actually going to work faster for quick sales that you're trying to make advertising your service or your product. It doesn't matter if you're selling to, excuse me, like a business to consumer, business to business. Pretty much all of this will apply to everybody. You're just trying to do search advertising, trying to decide between Google and Bing. You're on Google, have some questions whether or not Bing work. I'm answering all those questions in this video. Which one actually works faster? I'm also going to actually cover, even though it's not in the title topic, what works better, what you're going to get more overall on, what has more ROI potential, why you would want to use one over the other, why you might want to use both, maybe why you'd only want to use one. All of that's going to be covered in today's video. Okay, so respectively, if you're trying to basically start out, it does a little bit depend on your situation. Not everybody's going to have the same exact answer. I can't give you a one-size-fits-all answer. What I can do is give you as much information as possible for you to make your decision and give you the answer that applies to most people. Also, and then with some of the extraneous circumstances where the thing that works for 90% of people out there, where it won't work and why, and then you can ultimately come up with your own decision as to whether or not you're going to take my base level advice or try to go the other direction. And for what it comes down to, everybody's trying to make money with their ads before they go broke. They want to hit break even, if you will, so that they can self-finance their ads, because if you do that, it's all a downhill slide from there. You should be thrilled if you hit that point, because you're going to keep getting better and better from there on. In order to do that, we need to be able to narrow down the selections, because there's so many platforms out there, right? Now you're thinking about, should I be Google? Should I be Bing? And then you also have Facebook, Taboola, LinkedIn, whatever. All this other stuff out there. You got to narrow it down to something that's most likely, or should anyway, most likely to work. That way you're most likely whatever wad of cash you have to invest is going to start paying off and hit that break-even point before you go broke. This is going to also, of course, help you do it. Now, I mentioned on other videos, search engine advertising is usually the place where you start out for 90% of businesses, in which I've set up hundreds of campaigns for hundreds of different companies myself in the last 15 years. Search campaigns are where I start. The only time search campaigns generally don't work is in a situation where all the ad spaces are pretty much dominated by huge companies that may not even be making the ads at surface level profitable, or the ROI is so far down the road in terms of them needing like 10 purchases from that customer before the ad actually pays for itself, that going into something else, a display advertisement somewhere, someplace, Facebook, or maybe it's on Google Display Network, is a better entry point for you to start making money with PPC, or just in general to be able to make money for your company. So search advertising is where you generally start, and I would recommend for you to start, unless you fall into that category I mentioned. Basically, it was the one thing that and why you wouldn't start there. The question comes down to whether I'm going to use the Bing or Google search ads, or both, right? Or just just stick with the one. Generally speaking, most people, because they have, when they heard of Google, somebody that is in business has mentioned Google to them, they go with they think that's the tried and true option, and I don't blame them. Bing is like, for most people that don't use Bing, they don't obviously like, what the hell, Bing? People actually still use that? I can tell you for sure, people still use that. It's 10 to 20% of the search market, and for some some individual markets, it's going to be as high as 30-40%, depending on who you're selling to, what niche you're in. And some, it's basically less than 5%. I will admit that, but there's always some, and I'll explain. For most people, Bing is going to work, which is 90% of people, Bing is going to work to deliver sales to some level, which is at the ROI that you need it to be, some more than others. So, but Bing has its distinct advantages. Google has its distinct advantages. I'm going to explain what those are so you can make the decision if you're going to do both or just one, and more specifically, what makes money faster so you know which one to start out on. Bing, for the first thing, Google and Bing technically have their own strengths, as I mentioned, particularly as it pertains to what niche you're in. Therefore, the answer may be different based upon what you're selling, i.e., mainly if whom you're selling to. Miswrote this slightly here. Whom you're selling to are either older. When I say older, we're talking about 55 plus here. Old grandpa or granny that can barely, didn't grow, quote unquote, grow up on this stuff, as they say. Therefore, they henpeck the keyboard with one finger. It's kind of, if you've never actually had an opportunity to see your parents or what have you use Google, you should do it as a learning experience if you're selling to an older demographic, because you'll be quite surprised. And that'll put a great level of perspective on what you're doing, both in terms of the font sizes and stuff like that you use. Of course, they use different search engines and skews one way there. And there's a lot of things of selling to older people you have to think about, but one of which is a lot of people are going to be using Bing by default. And people that are just less tech savvy in general are going to skew more to Bing, okay? That's not going to determine whether or not Bing is more profitable than Google. What I mentioned in here about the older demographic and the less tech savvy in general, generally speaking, has to do with the amount of proportion of all the customers that are using search engines to buy will be buying from Bing versus Google. Now, I will admit that the ROI is higher on Bing when you're talking about somebody at the very high spectrum of the age demographic. You're selling to someone 75 plus. Why? Because going back to what I said before, people have the older they get, the harder the time they have doing online business, okay? And so they can't type very fast, they can't see as well as they used to. They may not even have the reading glasses available. You get stuff to think about. And so what happens is they're going to use a website. They're less likely to go shop around, even though they may have the time to retire, because it's difficult for them. So if they start out on Bing, they're not going to be going to Google and searching around and all this other crap. And so whereas Bing has an older demographic in general, so you can know that people that use Bing are also less likely to shop around, so you can get away with a little higher prices. Not to say you should take advantage of our respected elders, but that's certainly the case. And then therefore the conversion rate though will be higher. They're going to on average click through less sites, as I've found, and just studying how things work with older people, understanding how they interact with the internet in general. They'll be able to make money with PPC. This is something I've studied quite thoroughly, that you'll get a higher conversion rate as well, which also contributes to making potentially your decision just to go with Bing exclusively maybe, or at least go with it secondarily to Google. I will say, if I haven't said it already, 90% of the time I'm doing Google and Bing. And for that matter, I'm doing lots of platforms for most companies. It's just a matter of figuring out your numbers going in. What does your cost per conversion need to be to hit your margins in terms of your cost of product or service to be delivered, what your general overhead is, and figure out with the cost of the advertising what number you need to hit. And once you do that, you go ahead and you, for instance, start with Google, because most people do, like I said. You do everything you can to get that out. And when you start to struggle to get more conversions at the same cost per conversion or ROI that you need, instead of just constantly working harder for less and less progress, you switch over to another platform, which is untapped, which is usually Bing, which is second. And once you do that, then perhaps you go to, for me, realistically, I'm going to the landing page or the site. I'm looking to overhaul that. Then I'm going back to Google, then going back to Bing again, because there'll be new things that open up. And that'll be easier than trying to get Facebook ads to work, which usually take a good 6 months with a runway really to get going, that kind of thing. Most of the time. But it's always about picking the next lowest hanging fruit. And so if you know your numbers, you go and you do whatever you think is easiest, and the next thing and the next thing. And you just can't be afraid to go to different platforms to get that next lowest hanging fruit, okay? So you got to think about it not emotionally, but indiscriminately, knowing what you're willing to pay for a customer, bid for appropriately for that customer, In all the places you can get it online, there are a bunch of different places you can run ads. You can run ads on Quora. You can run ads on Reddit. Of course, you got YouTube ads. There's all these other places that have ad networks now. Spotify. And you're just seeing what you can get out of it. Some places, there's no customers you can get, I will admit. Some places, it just doesn't have your customer in it. It's not right for your type of product or service. But you go out and you get it wherever you can get it. And Bing usually, if something works on Google, it will always work on Bing 90% of the time. So I'm doing both. And it's just not a matter of if I'm doing Bing 90% of the time. It's when I'm doing Google until we get that diminishing level returns from our efforts. Then we're going to Bing. Primarily just moving our ads from Google over to Bing with their import tool, checking everything over. And then once you move everything to Bing, I adjust the bids on everything on Bing individually because Bing has different market rates for everything. Even though you're targeting the same keywords, that stuff usually ports directly over. But what one keyword produces on Bing is a different level of ROI than Google. So therefore, I will want to run it a little bit more aggressively on Bing than I would normally in terms of the percentage of what they call impression share or number of times the ad can show up for a certain keyword and how high in the list it'll show up, therefore affecting how many clicks we get compared to Google, which we're only going to be able to and willing to bid so aggressively because if we do be any more aggressive, then we're not going to meet our target cost per conversion or ROI that we're looking for there. So anyway, just a quick prelude about this stuff. And any more Google haters, if you were wondering, just as an aside, that people don't like to use Google, just go pretty much more so to DuckDuckGo. Where you have Bing come in, if you don't know it already, specifically, and the reason why it skews older and less tech savvy is because when you download a PC or buy a PC, basically when I say PC, I mean not Mac. You get Internet Explorer by default on your computer, and when you get on Internet Explorer, when you first boot it up, Bing is the default search engine. So they're riding on the coattails of this, and they have, and they're making billions of dollars a year revenue just by having that. Very valuable. Apple had sold default rights on their Safari browser to Google. So anyway, just as a side thing, that's where your sales are coming from Bing and why they are what they are, to help just explaining to help you decide that, maybe your product isn't right for Bing. You're in that 10% where it wouldn't apply. But anyway, so now you know. Now you can make an informed decision. If you are somewhere in the middle of, in terms of the spread of who your customers are, young and old versus just old or just young, and serve pretty much all audience types there, or want to serve all audience types, and you're not trying to just kick out the young guns or the young ones because maybe they don't have the budget for what you have, or they're paying whatever your reason is. Then the next question you have to ask yourself to determine whether you're going to do Google or Bing, and besides the whole factor of which one works faster, which I'm going to actually answer here in a moment, is how much money do I have to that nut of cash to invest before it needs to make its own return to self-finance the ad and keep the ads going, and how much time do I have to reach a base level of sales, meaning do you have overhead? Sometimes you'll lose money to get the volume quicker because you have employees to pay for, and so there's a sweet spot which it doesn't make any sense to start slower. You're already running the first day you're in business versus a lot of people they're bootstrapping or whatever there. So anyway, I drew a couple charts here to illustrate how fast the Google is going to actually work versus Bing, so you can decide which one's for you. Still, given one works faster than another, but there's also second things to think about. It's not just about just faster. There's two or three other elements to think about in addition to that I thought was important that I wanted to add to the video basically. And so this first chart is to demonstrate ROI percentage potential. So this is like is to say as I mentioned before, the smart people that usually in the top 20% that make money with PPC and the 80% that don't make money with PPC fail to do this one thing, which is to figure out what their target ROI needs to be with their ads in terms of ratio of ad spend to sales before they start. And so respectively, that a lot of times be like an 8 ratio of sales to ad spend to be profitable. You got to figure out what your margins are. You've got to really dig into your numbers, because if you don't, you're going to get into it and you're going to scratch your head and you're going to say, I wonder if I'm wasting my time because I'm getting all these sales, my bank account's not going up. Then you're going to have to do it anyway. So you might as well do it ahead of time and save yourself some anxiety, potential anxiety later on in the process, and or not skip a beat once you're up and going. Because if you pause and then you restart, you're going to lose your momentum with your ads too. So as I've found, you're going to get a higher ROI, certainly with Bing. As I mentioned on my other videos about Bing, if you want to check those out, you can. But it's going to take longer to get to, basically a reasonable level of ROI than it is with Google. So Google takes off faster. It makes money technically faster. At least in terms of, if you're just looking at gross revenue, Google brings in gross revenue faster, but it plateaus quicker and stays overall lower in terms of the actual ROI, or ratio of the sales to ad spend that you can get over time. So respectively, Google will start out fast with the amount of sales that you're making, way quicker than Bing, because Google has actually more data. They have Chrome browser. They have Google Analytics. They understand their users better than Bing. Like I said, Bing's riding on the coattails of one simple thing there, which, they have the activity of people who use Windows 10 and all that, but it's still not to the same level of what data Google has, using Google and understanding people's thoughts there. And they record every action that people do, and store that data on every user they have. If you don't know that, they definitely do, and why Google is a $100 billion a year company that just from their Google advertising, Google Ads program. So you'll get sales quicker, and then you won't totally stop making money from Google Ads. It'll just go up a lot slower. We want to say 6 months in, you'll start, be able to keep making more money, but the rate of growth will slow down. Bing, it might take 6 to 8 months. Realistically, even if you have the keywords that you had from Google, you just import it to Bing. For Bing to figure out, in terms specifically like the keyword matching, because the keyword match types are very different in Bing than they are on Google. They're a lot more wild in terms of how closely the user searches to the keyword that you put in Bing. And so you need to set up conversion tracking and do a lot more with negative keywords generally. You need to give Bing more data to understand better how to run your ads effectively. And so the ROI you won't get as much sales and this assumes you have the same ad budget for Google and Bing and started out at the same place. Bing will start to get sales a lot slower. You should definitely expect it to go up. And maybe when you get to about 8 months in, you'll cross the threshold in terms of the number, respectively the gross volume of sales, but the ROI will surpass Google once you get 6 to 8 months in, and then it'll blow past Google to where you're getting respectively about twice the ROI Google has. Okay. And then it'll just stay twice as high as Google has, even though Bing will also keep getting better and better over time, but it'll plateau out like Google does. It just doesn't start to plateau out until later. So it starts out slower and then plateaus out later as well. So depending on if you need a lot of sales quickly or not, depends on which one you might actually do first. If you're not doing any advertising, I would just go with Google first, because you're going to get proof of concept the quickest, basically. Once you have the proof of concept, then you can do Bing, which is why I do it the way that I do it there, just as I described it to you there. If you're starting out with less money, you could put a really small budget on Bing, and knowing that if you don't have a strong ROI, that you're going to basically run out of money, you could go with Bing on a small budget, be patient, and knowing that the ROI you're going to get is about twice as good as what Google is going to provide. With also knowing that, going into our second chart here, the total sales volume you're going to get is only going to be, if you're in the right niche, again, going back to what I said before, this won't apply to every niche, but 20% of what Google can provide by default. You have to know that going in. So the reward is less. There's a lot less overall potential, but the ROI is potentially double. Why? Because it has a little bit higher conversion rate for the reasons I described. And the traffic itself for the same keywords is a little cheaper than Google. They price it cheaper so they compete with Google. Otherwise, people say, oh, they don't use Bing, they don't understand it, they don't, it's just 20%, forget it. And so they have to do something to be competitive. And so volume-wise, Google's better. So you get your initial sales quicker. The overall sales volume will be more, but the ROI will be less, approximately half as much as what Bing will be, assuming that you're in a normal market where, you have older / tech-savvy people in there that ultimately are going to be the ones who use Bing in the first place. So if you need a super high ROI, you could start out with Bing. It won't work as fast. If you want sales quicker for proof of concept, definitely go with Google. Just note the ROI won't be quite as big as with Bing. You might actually, if you need an 8-to-1 ROI, get that with Google. I don't want to say Google has a crappy ROI. It doesn't. You're just going to get probably more ROI with Bing. It's just you're going to have to wait a little longer. And then respectively, if you do Google now and you're thinking about going to Bing, I also made this chart and explained it the way that I did so that if you're switching over to Bing, you're going to use Google to Bing's import tool, that you don't get discouraged because it's not going to work as fast as Google. It's its own beast. You're going to have to give it some time for it to work. It will definitely, if keyword A works on Google and you're in a market where, like I said, you're older, skew a little, if you have an older / tech-savvy audience in there to some degree, it will work on Bing. It's just a matter of when. And that when is just going to be a little bit longer in terms of what you see on Google, but the reward is greater on the other side if you're looking for if what you call reward is the highest possible ROI that I can get. Okay, so depending on your situation, you may go with Google, you may go with Bing. Most people, like I mentioned with myself, I'm going to do both. I'm not going to do both at the same time. I'm going to go Google, understand what keywords are basically garbage, toss those out. Once I know which ones are there, hopefully I get my return on Google. If I don't, lower my bids till I get the return that I want, and then import those same keywords into Bing, and then I'll be able to get an extra bonus off of Bing, given 10 to 20% of the search market there from what we sell is also on Bing. Hopefully that made sense. I have a ton of other videos on this channel about other money-making PPC strategies. If you haven't seen any of those videos, I strongly encourage you to check those out. I have a blog at guaranteedppc.com/blog with step-by-step instructions on how to build campaigns the way that I build them for our clients to guarantee the results. You should check those out if you want some information along those lines. If you have any questions or comments about anything I mentioned here, things that you think I should have covered and didn't, leave a comment down below. I get back to every single person who leaves me a comment on this channel within a day or two. Apart from that, I hope you enjoyed the video, and good luck to you in setting up your new Google or Bing campaigns for you, and hope that that helped you get the courage to do what you were intending to do, and now that you know how to do it a little bit better than you did before.